it was just so plain, clear, that I still can't get to grips with what I actually seen that night.
We said, shall we go back and see what it is? And just everything on your body was stood up like that, like the hackles on the back of your neck and all that lot.
Freezing cold, absolutely
freezing cold. And we said, no, sod this, like, let's go home, like, you know.
I saw all the time the shimmering of the air. And then it was that my wife said, do you see that in the far distance? What do you mean? Yeah, there is something moving. It is like a man on horseback. And I looked and said, yes, you are true, how is that possible? And it was a man in gallop. He was galloping there, and he came nearer and nearer, and the shimmering of the air made the whole figure very unreal and very fantastic. I said, how is that possible? It is if the legs of the horse do not touch the ground at all, and it is if the whole figure is floating towards us.
Bodmin Moor in Cornwall is one of the most beautiful parts of England. Wild, untamed, mysterious. The high moorland runs down to the sea to create the romantic Cornish coastline of steep cliffs, narrow rocky coves and inlets. And the whole area is knee-deep in a heady mixture of myths and legends, part fact, part fiction, part history, part fairy tale. Stories of Arthur and the court of Camelot, of a mysterious Celtic priesthood, of civil war and smugglers. Moreover, for as long as people can remember, Bodmin has been steeped in stories of the paranormal. Some believe it has to do with the strange qualities of the granite rock itself.
I suspect that what is special about Cornwall is that it's mainly granite, and that this may have something to do with the fact that you get such a very high proportion of so-called psychic events taking place in Cornwall. We've got an enormous number of standing stones, and my own investigation of these standing stones has convinced me that they were stuck in like sort of stone needles into acupuncture points in the earth. Certainly the places where there are standing stones appear to have some extremely powerful ambience to which the dowsing rod responds quite directly.
Paranormal activity has been going on for a very long time on the moor and in North Cornwall, and indeed in the whole of Cornwall. And I believe that it is an ongoing process. And my great hope is that before many years have passed, that we shall see a major breakthrough in the paranormal field, that the reality will be established. And on the evidence of the past, I think there's a very good chance of that breakthrough being made here in Cornwall.
But whatever the reason, geology or Celtic mystery, there is no doubt that there are various sites on the moor where many different people at quite different times claim to have seen events they simply cannot explain. One of them, for example, is St Nectan's Glen, the site of an ancient Celtic monastery founded almost 1500 years ago. The glen is one of those places where myth and magic intermingle. But that having been said, many visitors go away convinced there is still a monastery somewhere in the valley. They've seen the monks.
St Nectan's Glen is a piece of paradise, really. It's got steeped in history, going back to the Druids even used to worship up here. King Arthur, his knights were baptised in the Cave before they went in search of the Holy Grail. And you'll actually see some red stones in the glen, in the river, that are locally known as bloodstones. And they're supposed to be, when King Arthur had his last battle at Slaughter-Bridge, all the wounded and dying coming back through the glen to get to the castle, their blood landed on the rocks, and it's just stayed ever since.
My granddaughter, when she was very small, often used to see a man walking across, and it was always away from the patio. Actually, he must have been walking on the air, because there was a vast drop, where he was seen. And then lots of the visitors have come up and said that they see this old man standing at the edge of the building, very old man with a beard, rather stooping in a monk's habit.
St Nectan's Glen runs down to the sea at the ancient fishing port of Tintagel, the very heartland of Arthurian legend. Were the Knights of the Round Table here in the dark years between the departure of the Romans and the coming of the Norsemen? Some years ago, a Dutchman spent a holiday here with his wife. He remembers what happened to him as clearly as if it happened yesterday.
I saw the man on the horse now more clearly. I could see how he was dressed. I saw, first of all, a strange hat. It was a hat with a white brim, folded up on the front and going back there. And he was totally in black. He had a coat in white, pleats hanging down, and I saw there was embroidery on that coat. And I saw his boots, who were soft leather, and as well, of course, spurs I saw. And then the horse stepped forward to a nearby hawthorn. And the man dismounted, and he walked to the hawthorn and tied the reins on a low hanging branch of the tree. The shimmering of the air increased. It was all waving, and at that moment, all at once, the man and the horse disappeared totally. I was totally flabbergasted. My wife said, "How is that possible? Would you believe it?" she said. I said to her, "Come, let me go back to the beach. It is so hot here. Let me go back to the beach." We didn't talk so much to each other anymore. She grabbed my arm. We walked down to the beach. And she said, "Is it possible that it was King Arthur?" I said, "Who else could it have been?"
I don't think the Dutch artist on the cliffs of Tintagel saw King Arthur. I think King Arthur belonged to a much earlier period of time. But he undoubtedly saw something of a supernatural nature. You can't have a horse and rider seen very vividly and in detail by the man and his wife, there one moment and gone the next. I think that the rider was stylishly dressed, would suggest that it was more likely to be within a smuggling context, because we've got to remember that the gentry were involved with smuggling.
During the 18th century, the whole coastline was rife with smuggling activity. The lonely isolated beaches, the country lanes, the inns and farmhouses on the moor. And so swinging were the taxes on alcohol that all classes were involved, landed gentry as well as poor fishermen. It was a dangerous trade. If you were caught, you could be hanged from the nearest tree. At the historic old hostelry of Jamaica Inn, it seems that the sounds of the smugglers still ring out.
We live here immediately above this room, and this used to be the old stable block. And you know, I imagine that in the day it was a stable block, it'd been an old cobbled floor, and probably 3, 4, 5 times a year one can hear ponies paddling about down here, people shouting, talking, and this won't go on for just 2 or 3 minutes, it'll probably go on for 2 hours. The dialect that people talking is not understandable to my ears. I would think probably it's of a Cornish dialect, and it just goes on. You can hear people outside shouting, talking, as if coaches and carriages were being unloaded and stuff being banged about. You can look out of the window, you can come downstairs, you can see nothing, but the noise still continues.
Val is the cook at Jamaica Inn, as practical and down-to-earth a lady as you could find. But even Val has had her ghostly experiences.
The ghost that goes through the door has a cloak on, but it's mostly a cloak. It's not, you know, like with no head or no, you know, it's just a cloak with a big collar, and it starts off here and it goes over here and goes out there in the stable bar. And it's very frightening, and I just go down to the kitchen and close the door behind me, which makes me more secure.
I was working as head chef at the Jamaica Inn, and we finished work on the Saturday night at about 11:15 and was proceeding to drive home across Bodmin Moor towards Tor Point. And about 2 miles down the road, rounded this corner, all of a sudden I seen this figure hanging from a tree. And I said to Tam, "Did you see anything, Tam?" And he looked at me.
Well, actually says, I know what I seen. What did you see?
I said, "A guy hanging from a tree, like, you know."
And I says, that is exactly what I seen as well.
And we said, "Shall we go back and see what it is?" And just everything on your body was stood up like that, like the hackles on the back of your neck and all that lot.
Freezing cold, absolutely freezing cold.
And we said, "No, sod this, like, let's go home, like, you know." But every night since then, when we was going backwards and forwards to work, when you come back at night, you just instantly freeze and your hairs all stand up on the back of your neck as you go through.
And I can remember colours that night. I can remember black, I can remember white, and I can also remember red. A red scarf, or not a cravat, but just something red. I can remember black boots, shiny black boots. It was just so plain, clear, that I still can't get to grips with what I actually seen that night.
Galloping horsemen, the sounds of smugglers, bodies hanging from trees. Around Tintagel and Jamaica Inn, such stories are almost commonplace. But 10 miles or so across the moor, in the village of Altonan, there is a cluster of quite different stories around the old vicarage, of a vicar and his mistress, and a distraught chambermaid who drowned herself in the village stream. The old vicarage in the village of Altonan is called Penhallow, a name which means on the edge of the moor. The present house was built in the middle of the last century by the Reverend Tripp. He is actually buried in the churchyard, but notably not alongside his wife. He lies with another lady called Mary Hurley, who may have been his housekeeper. Penhallow has been a focus of paranormal activity for many years, some of it seemingly associated with Mary Hurley herself.
Penhallow has been there for some, you know, it was the rectory originally, and the church sold it off, and it's not the original house. The original one was burnt down. This one was built in 1842, but it's been on that site for many generations, as far as I'm aware. It used to have stables and coach house and everything. It was in the days when the vicars were really somebody. You know, they ran the rooster. They were the top dog in the village. He lived with his wife in the house, but he also had a house. They had a housekeeper, who was a little bit, shall we say, a little more than a housekeeper. And she's seen sometimes standing at the back door of the house. She's been seen by several people, as far as I know, and she's buried just outside the gate to the house, beside the vicar. The wife isn't. Don't know where the wife's buried, but apparently they were having an affair.
There definitely is a presence in the house. We could often hear strange noises, like people going up and down the stairs, when we knew there was no one in the house. And it wasn't a nasty presence, you know, it was a friendly sort of ghost, if you want. Perhaps it is the housekeeper. Perhaps she doesn't approve of having a licensed premises now, being, you know, an old vicarage. I think she used to look after all the old vicars and what have you then, and perhaps she doesn't like it.
Last week we had a guest staying here on Thursday night who was disturbed for whatever reason in the night, awoke to see a lady dressed in grey, Quaker sort of dress, she said, standing at the corner of her bed for what seemed like several minutes, and then she just disappeared. No harm done, nothing thrown about, but definitely a sighting.
Harry Cleverly was called in by the previous owners of Penhallow to help them with some strange, unexplained experiences in the house that were occurring again and again.
We told him that we'd heard the footsteps going across this room, and he came across and walked around the house, didn't he?
Yeah.
But he said he saw something in the next room
Yeah.
to this room. But then, of course, we did realise that possibly the rooms had changed. You know, perhaps the walls hadn't always been exactly the same places.
Some time ago, when the previous owner had it, they called me up because they heard footsteps overhead. Didn't frighten them, but they were just interested. So I went up there, and I saw in one of the bedrooms, well, there were 2 bedrooms actually, they are now 3 and 4, but at that time, I think at one time there must have been one big room, because I saw this vicar, I think he was, in a frock coat, pacing up and down with his hands behind his back, as if he was puzzling out his sermon for the coming service. At least that's the impression I got.
Harry Cleverly lives in the village. Late one evening, walking his dog, he had another strange experience as he passed the gates of Penhallow.
About midnight, witching hour as always, and I got to the bridge, and the dog stopped, and his hackles rose, and I felt cold, felt this icy feeling, and I looked up, and there was this entity floating down through coming down the path beside the church, came round and walked straight through the gate, which was shut, and went off up the road and disappeared. And I didn't know very much about them, you know, at the time. And I inquired around, and somebody said, "Oh, you've seen her, have you?" And he didn't tell me what had happened, but apparently she comes down the lane behind the church. Where she comes from, nobody actually knows, and what she did. But I found out later that behind the post office there used to be a swampy land there, and she fell in that and drowned herself, apparently.
As so often in these circumstances, we're left with a judgment to believe or not to believe these stories. There are slender links with the history of the place. There have been sightings by several people, but these can scarcely be called confirmation of anything. Is there any other kind of verification that we could plug into? We decided to call in another psychic medium. With no notice whatsoever, we took her to the old vicarage on the moor. She claims to have no knowledge of Altonan or Penhallow. She claims to have had no contact of any kind with Harry Cleverly. Indeed, she was quite prepared to take a lie detector test. We asked her simply to recount her impressions.
Well, this is a favourite, very favourite place of a man that I'm interested in, whose room I believe it was. This is a reverend gentleman, and this room was much bigger. In fact, it actually goes in beyond here. One long room, and there's books. It's lined with books. It's a bolt hole for this gentleman. It is a place where he did his own personal spiritual work. In sight of the church, through this window, he walked for his sermons up and down from window to window, and this view of the way in was almost to him as if it was his spiritual pathway through. That may sound a little, but this is how his personality comes. And he had to get away from the rest of the household many times. I think feels as if there's a bit of an undercurrent, which wouldn't have been mentioned in those days. This is a Victorian gentleman, and there was a lot of things going on in this household which he needed to escape from. Let us put it that way.
He became himself in this room. He wasn't all formal. He became himself. I'm not sure if he actually played an instrument. I feel as if he might have had a fiddle or a pipe, but he became himself here and almost danced and threw himself on the bed, you know, and that kind of thing. Was free. The only place he felt free. That's how I feel about him. But undercurrents, yes. Other occupants of the house, I feel, that are concerned with his family, perhaps, are a little more intricate. I think that I would rather not particularly say how I feel about that, but that it feels that he's living two lives here. Being a rector or a vicar, it would have to have been a double life, and I felt that was some concern that his very personal life was wrapped up with one of the occupants of the house. In other words, you know, he was probably having an affair with one of the occupants of the house, and it was very happy. It was very, if I may be so bold to say, very beautiful. It was a very good heart connection with this lady.
As Shelley moved around the vicarage, she picked up another contact, as she called it, in what used to be the old kitchens.
I went into the back of the house because I felt drawn to do so. I feel that it is a very active place in the kitchen area, and I was strongly convinced of previous scullery maid, or perhaps that would be too... she was a servant that worked in the kitchen. A delightful girl, but there are undertones, and she knows more intimate stories about the owners in the Victorian period than perhaps others would. And she lived in a cottage which is no longer down by the bridge, the old bridge in the village. It is now a space. There were a row of cottages there. I saw them, and the bridge itself connected with her, and I believe that she fell at the bridge and was drowned. And this is the young woman who worked here.
So, two mediums, who claim to have had no previous contact, coming up with remarkably similar stories. And right across the moor there are countless stories from people who've had strange experiences so real and so vivid that they're imprinted upon their memories, never to be forgotten. There are, as we've heard, theories that have been bandied about. The somewhat unusual properties of the granite rock itself, the mysteries of the Celtic brain, and so on. But there are precious few explanations. The only facts would seem to be that the area is indeed rich in history and event, and that people have had experiences here that have changed their view of life and death.